All right, welcome everyone to today's Masterclass Explainer. Go ahead and grab a seat because today we are actually treating this explainer like a classroom lecture. We're going to be unpacking a really brilliant, analytically serious text about the economic systems of Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mali. We're looking at a region that's at an absolute crossroads right now, facing choices that will literally determine whether the next generation inherits real prosperity or just remains caught in this generational growth trap. So, I want to kick things off with a question. What truly holds a regional economy back? I mean, if you just casually look at the news or listen to the loudest political speeches, you'd probably think the answer is completely obvious, right? You hear about colonial legacies, foreign interference, and especially the currency. But as the data in our source text actually shows, we are often focused on the exact wrong target. We get totally distracted by the noise, and we end up missing the structural reality right in front of us.
And that brings us to this incredibly powerful quote, which is basically the central thesis of our lecture today. The currency hides the real problem. It's a really stark warning. It tells us that the super intense, incredibly loud debate over the CFA franc is actually acting as a smokescreen. It's masking far deeper structural, fiscal, and institutional damages that are quietly hollowing out these economies from the inside.
Okay, here is our syllabus for today. We're going to systematically break down this macroeconomic puzzle, moving from the illusion of the currency to the trade-offs of stability, the fiscal crisis, the integration trap, and finally, the choices ahead. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the CFA franc illusion and its 1945 legacy. We have to start with the currency because, well, that's where all the noise is. Let's establish a really basic definition here. The CFA franc is a pegged currency. It's fixed to the euro at exactly 6.55 to 1. To really wrap your head around this, think of a pegged currency like a landlord's thermostat. The landlord, in this historical case, Paris or Europe, sets the temperature. Now, this arrangement guarantees you won't freeze to death from hyperinflation. The temperature stays incredibly stable. But, and this is the massive trade-off, you completely lose the ability to touch the dial when your own economy catches a fever and desperately needs adjusting. Now, it is incredibly easy to see why there's legitimate anger surrounding this setup. Just imagine being one of 150 million people living under a system that originated way back in 1945, where historically up to 65% of your nation's sovereign wealth, your foreign exchange reserves, had to be parked in the French treasury. It is completely understandable why a setup like that fuels fierce cries for independence and economic dignity. Moving to Section 2, stability versus sovereignty. Here, we really have to look past that political anger and examine the hard macroeconomic data. There is a really stark contrast we need to talk about. The West African Economic and Monetary Union region, so the CFA zone, experiences an average annual inflation of just 2 to 3%. Now, compare that to neighbors who actually left the franc zone, like Guinea at 20% or the legendary collapse of Zimbabwe at 200%. Price stability is not just some abstract academic concept for a textbook. It is the literal difference between a family saving surviving the year or them facing total monetary chaos. However, there is a really heavy price to pay for that. Returning to our thermostat analogy, let's look at the 2016 cocoa price crash. Because Cote d'Ivoire couldn't devalue its currency to cool down the economic shock, remember, they couldn't touch the dial, the only way to adjust was through forced, absolutely brutal austerity cuts, slashing wages, slashing public spending, and who pays for that? The poorest citizens. The currency hides the real problem until an external shock forces it out into the open. All right. Section 3, the real fiscal crisis. Pay attention here because this is perhaps the most crucial point on today's syllabus. The real crisis holding back the region isn't the currency, it is fundamental fiscal failure. These numbers are honestly devastating. Senegal sits at an 18% tax to GDP ratio. Mali is at 14%. For context, the OECD average is 34%. Development economists universally agree you need at least 20% just to keep the lights on. So the absolute crucial point here is that these governments aren't failing because of the CFA franc. They are failing because they simply cannot collect enough taxes to fund basic public services. You literally cannot build schools, roads, or clinics if the state cannot fund itself. And this vividly brings us to Senegal's current situation. With Senegal pumping new oil in 2024, history is basically presenting a stark test. Resource windfalls really only do one of two things. They either build incredibly strong institutions like we see in Norway, or they completely destroy them through corruption and patronage, kind of like what we've seen in Nigeria. The difference there isn't geology, it's governance.
Everything connects to everything else, and Senegal's fiscal discipline right now is the ultimate test. Meanwhile, Côte d'Ivoire grows an absolutely astounding 40% of the world's cocoa. But here is exactly where the growth trap snaps shut. Without domestic processing, they are growing, sure, but they are not transforming. The chocolate making, the branding, the retail, all the real profits from that are captured in Europe. A fiscal system that relies entirely on raw exports is just incredibly fragile. Then we have the deeply tragic case study of Mali. Following recent military coups, leaders essentially expelled foreign influence in the name of sovereignty. But think about it. When you expel influence but completely lose functional fiscal systems, what actually happens? Borders close, aid stops, and the economy collapses. There is a morally urgent reality here. The cost of this chaos isn't being paid by the generals. It is paid by ordinary children who lose their schools and farmers who lose their livelihoods. Section 4. The integration trap. We really must examine why you absolutely cannot build a world-class economy in a fractured, isolated market.
Just 15%. Despite sharing a currency, a central bank, and common trade rules on paper, intra-regional trade in West Africa is a dismal 10 to 15%. Now compare that to the European Union, which manages over 60%. You just cannot build a thriving global economy and a market that functions like a series of disconnected, mid-sized cities. The gap between integration on paper and integration in reality is just massive. So why is it so low? Well, welcome to the checkpoint economy. Consider a single truck driving from Abidjan to Bamako. It faces so many unofficial border bribes and delays that it actually adds 20 to 30% to transport costs. You can sign literally all the free trade agreements you want, but you cannot build a common market on top of a corruption tax. It completely paralyzes regional growth. And all of this builds into massive political theater. Just look at the missed targets for the proposed new regional currency, the ECO. 1999? Missed. 2003? Missed. 2005? 2010? All the way to 2020? Missed. This perfectly demonstrates how leaders use the promise of a shiny new monetary union as a lazy shortcut. They use it as a substitute for the incredibly hard, tedious work of actual on-the-ground integration, like harmonizing regulations and building real infrastructure. As we approach the end of our lecture, we reach Section 5, the choice ahead. Let's summarize the true barriers to West African prosperity. So, what should you take away from all this? The absolutely crucial takeaway from our lecture today is that the CFA franc is not the cage holding these nations back. The real cages are weak, corrupt institutions, catastrophic fiscal failure, and regional integration that only exists on paper in a treaty room somewhere. We're left with this profound academic warning from the text. Stability and sovereignty are not opposites, but leaders treat them that way. When political leaders sacrifice baseline economic stability in the name of aggressive political sovereignty, they ultimately end up with neither. And again, the real tragedy here is that it punishes the poorest, most vulnerable citizens the most. They are the ones who suffer when inflation spikes or schools close. As we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought for the real world. If changing the name on a banknote won't fix the schools, if it won't stop the highway checkpoints, and if it won't fund a health clinic, when will those in power finally address the structural rot underneath? Thank you so much for joining this masterclass. Keep questioning the headlines and keep learning.